40% of all successful ransomware attacks have been traced back to something that was actually known, the zero-day. One of the first lines of defense there, it's the endpoint protection, XDR tools. The big ones are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars per year on that. So just be super mindful, and a pretty good rule of thumb, if it feels a little bit shady, it's probably shady, and just think twice.
Welcome to Discover Dialogues podcast, powered by Tech Dogs. The world of business and technology is evolving at breakneck speed. AI breakthroughs, digital transformation, and game-changing innovations are reshaping industries every day. On this show, we dive into the trends, ideas, and strategies driving the future. We're sitting down with industry leaders, innovators, and disruptors to bring you fresh insights, bold perspectives, and real conversations that matter. So plug in, tune in, and let's discover what's next.
Today on the show, we have John Herrema, Chief Product Officer at Absolute Security, a company pioneering self-healing, AI-powered cybersecurity solutions. With a career spanning over 20 years, John has held leadership roles at BlackBerry, Good Technology, Microsoft, and even co-founded his own tech startup. His work sits right at the intersection of AI, enterprise security, and mobility, making him one of the most forward-thinking voices in the space. Let's dive in.
John, welcome to Discover Dialogues. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate this. John, one of the first questions that I have for you is looking at your career. You've been at the forefront of enterprise security for almost, I think, about 2 decades now, right? Can you walk us through your career path and how did you land up at Absolute Security today?
Yeah, no, it's well, I started, and I always had an early interest in doing things related to mobile. And that took me to actually starting a company called Vire. And that was acquired along the way by something called Visto. And then we acquired a company called Good Technology. And as part of that transition, we had the pleasure to have Christy Wyatt come in and become our CEO.
Oh, nice.
And as part of that team as well, there's another gentleman, Will Morris and Nico Van Summer. And we were all part of that team at Good Technology. And what we were doing there was essentially enabling iPhone and Android devices to be used in high security situations, bank, healthcare, Department of Defense, and really for the first time enabling those platforms at a comparable level to what BlackBerry devices traditionally supported. So that team, we all met each other there. And then Christy later became the CEO of Absolute Security. And Will and Nico joined up there. And then I saw an opportunity to come back in and just rejoin that amazing team. So that was a very easy decision. But I think the other really interesting part, just from the company standpoint, as a product person, as a product person, even when it's not necessarily true, you're always trying to claim we have something that is first, best, and only, and important. And what's so unique about Absolute, I mean, when we look at the position we have in the firmware and some of the uniqueness we have there, that was really almost the first time in my career I saw a set of capabilities that I could say with a straight face, that is truly first, best, only, and important. So that made it even more, no-brainer to join up with the team. And we put the band back together, so to speak. And there's the 4 of us there. And I don't know, I hope I'm not Ringo in that group, but nevertheless, we did put the group back together.
So from what I read about you, I think at some point you were a part of the business development function, and then you moved on to product management and obviously product leadership today. And those 2 areas may not necessarily go hand in hand, but I'm assuming that also got you unique perspectives. So this transition, was there a drifting moment? Or a defining moment rather, where you said, this is what I would want to continue doing?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because back when I first started working in mobility, I was actually on the product side at Sprint PCS and helped start that up and launch those first products. When I went to Microsoft, I shipped over to the business side and that business development role, in part because we were trying to build relationships back into that industry that I came from. But I think what's so unique about the product role in general is that, you get to build things and sometimes you buy things and you have to be aware of the financial side and the marketing side. So I think it's very natural, particularly when you think about acquisition as a means to, enhance your portfolio. I think really good product leaders sort of inherently kind of operate across all those spheres. And that's what I've always loved about it, is that you're kind of, when you're the marketing person, they usually don't let you influence the architecture. But when you're the product person, you can influence marketing and how you sell and the financial side and the business side. So I really like that kind of role because you really touch all parts of the company. So,
John, endpoints are now a major cybersecurity concern. And what do you think makes endpoints the weakest link in enterprise security today?
well, I guess endpoints would be the weakest link somewhat by definition, an endpoint, but I think in some respects, more broadly speaking, they can be the weakest link overall. And I think one of the challenges there, it's kind of a simple math problem. Some of our largest customers have tens of thousands of users, or even hundreds of thousands of users, or multiple hundreds of thousands of users. And if you think about the number of endpoints these users typically have, could be one or more laptops, could be mobile device, and just the sheer number of things that you have to keep secured and updated and compliant and connected and all that. It sort of stands to reason that can be a little bit more challenging, especially now in the remote work era. Because in the old days, when everybody was inside the perimeter, if there was an issue with an endpoint, you could walk it down to the hall and hand it to somebody. Maybe they could help you get it back to its proper state. All those problems are amplified when you have this remote world we're in. And the simple fact is, all it takes is one of those endpoints to be exposed to a bad actor. And usually the strategy now is not so much they're going after what's on the endpoint. That just becomes the vector by which they start to land and expand throughout their environment. So I think in that respect, it can be that weakest link simply because the sheer number of things that you have to stay on top of.
And I think in the last decade or so, apart from the whole remote work piece, one of the changes that we've seen is that it's getting more complicated, or the threats are getting more advanced. So today you have ransomware. There've been a lot of example of those. Then you've had zero-day threats, which went viral at some point. But how do you then ensure that endpoints evolve to counter these threats?
Well, I think there's a few dimensions of that. I think on the one hand, and it kind of goes back to that sort of basic hygiene, problem that we were talking about, is there's sort of an alarming stat out there, and it depends on whose metric you use. But something like 40% of all successful ransomware attacks have been traced back to something that was actually known. So the interesting part about that is it's not always about what you don't know. So I think one of the challenges is really being able to apply more automation, because again, you think about the sheer numbers, the number of patches and so on. It's really hard for organizations to stay on top of that. So one opportunity for AI is to apply AI to this concept of desired state management, which means there's a state I know that I want the endpoint to be in terms of patching and security controls and all that kind of stuff, but they tend to drift. And our data shows us that they do drift. So, and it's not a problem that humans can stay on top of. So that's a natural opportunity to apply AI to, if I see something wrong, how can I automatically fix it, bring that thing back to a desired state so that we don't let the things we already know about become a problem. And then the second part of that is you're saying, of course, might be something we don't know, 0 day. One of the first lines of defense there, it's the endpoint protection, XDR tools. But what's interesting is our data shows us that a lot of times, you think about you using software to deploy software, you have this configuration and drift problem. Yeah. So what happens sometimes, to no fault of the tools themselves, they end up actually not deployed, not fully patched, not fully updated, not operational. And so that creates another opportunity for something to come in, because the tool you're relying on to protect against and detect a 0 day may not actually be operational at that moment. Yeah. So the other part there is that, again, how do I apply intelligence, self-healing, autonomy to make sure that those critical security controls are in place? Mm-hmm. If you get those two things sorted, then you're at least in a decent posture. I think then the other big opportunity for AI is around this notion of understanding the behavior of users and applications and the endpoints, and applying that, in combination with this notion of universal zero trust, which means I'm doing zero trust all the time. Doesn't matter if I'm remote, doesn't matter if I'm on premises. And the whole idea behind that is that how do I make sure that only trusted users and apps are connecting only to what they need to after being authenticated? And then even within that realm, basically monitoring and modeling the behavior. So you understand what is normal. And then if you start to see things drift away from that, then you can intervene. And a good example of that is insider threat. The interesting thing about insider threat is this is a user you trust to
Absolutely.
access what you've given them access to. By definition, they're going to be able to authenticate themselves,
Absolutely.
but they still might start to behave badly. So then how do you basically intervene in that kind of scenario? And you can imagine there's a similar dimension there where if malware or ransomware, maybe, for example, hijacks my credential and is impersonating me, being able to see that sort of drift and wait a minute, John doesn't normally go there, access this and so on. So you can see how, and these are big data problems. There's a lot of signals coming in and, millions per second if you're a large organization. So being able to apply AI to that, to sift through that and get the signal out and then be able to react to the signal when you see something unusual. That's all perfect opportunity for AI to be used for good, as opposed to some of the bad guys that are using it for bad.
Absolutely. And talking about insider threats, and I'm just going to veer off script because this is a very interesting topic. I think post-COVID, businesses changed how they work. What I mean by that, by then, a lot of enterprises or businesses had their own endpoints which were allotted out to, their employees and workforces. But then because of COVID, then there came a new age of startups or maybe businesses adapted to it, wherein, there was a lot of bring your own devices, that came into picture. Okay. And now, so you had some sort of a protocols and you're doing things to ensure that, at an enterprise level, I'm securing my endpoints to the best possible degree. And then you had, users who bought their devices to work, and then it threw up another set of challenges. Okay, and how do you think businesses or companies like yourself are today handling that? Well, for a better lack of word, shift or maybe both together.
Yeah, well, so it is always interesting when you have this kind of a shared ownership of the device. And so a big part of that's just, basically having the tools to make sure that your corporate data on that endpoint is understood, is visible, is trackable, it's removable. You can either selectively delete it or delete everything. And so being able to, retain that kind of ownership. Another big part of that strategy, a lot of companies are recognizing that, in fact, I need to make sure that I prevent that sprawl. So you see a lot of, there's a lot of remote technologies, enterprise browser, other things like that are emerging that either based on sort of a container principle or, virtualization or things like that, just making sure that the endpoint, the data doesn't end up on the endpoint to begin with. And that's hard when in remote, sometimes that impacts user experience. But the good news is there's two tools and technologies out there to handle that. And I think a lot of it is just sort of a lot of this comes down to policy and understanding who has access to what and who should I be paying attention to. Because, a lot of times there's the classic scenario where a lot of times an employee kind of knows that they might be on the way out the door before you do. Being able to, understand and monitor data flow and where things are moving. And so, and we have some technology in our portfolio that, for example, would allow us to see that unusual amounts of data are now actually moving from Salesforce out to Dropbox. Those are hard things to prevent just based on the technology on the endpoint itself, because the data does need to move around. So a lot of it is about understanding what is appropriate, what is unusual, what's anomalous. And when you see that anomaly occurring, how do you put the brakes on and stop it and intervene? So.
And we spoke about AI a little earlier, but then, given the context today when, I think attackers are evolving at the same pace as maybe perhaps what defenders are evolving at as well. How do you think that organizations today can use AI defensively to kind of stay ahead in the game?
Yeah, I think there's a few areas. I was just talking about the whole notion of basically behavior and entity analytics and just in modeling and understanding, not in a way that a human can, but in the way that a model can. What is the normal behavior for the user and for the organization collectively? And then also being able to understand that behavior by roles. There's an interesting aspect to that. What does a product manager normally access and do in our company? If I see John, the product manager, is starting to do unusual things. Maybe I should throw up a flag. So that's one thing that helps, and that helps for a lot of kind of insider threat scenarios or other scenarios where malware or something like that may have gotten a credential or access to the system is doing things that are unusual. So I think that's one area that's pretty well understood, but continues to evolve and becomes better. A really very interesting area that is emerging is this notion of, for a long time now, attack simulation and breach simulation has been part of the toolkit, red teams and so on. But what's interesting now is that you're starting to see AI and generative AI applied to those tools and services so that the attacks that are being simulated, are more likely to be novel and or adaptive.
Absolutely.
Rather than just sort of looking back at a pattern we saw before and then simulating that pattern.
Yeah.
That's good too. But if you think about it, the folks who are using this for bad are trying to be novel. They're trying to be adaptive. They're trying not to do exactly what they did before. And so being able to apply that same technology to that simulation phase, so that in that moment, you're seeing how your defenses hold up against something that might be novel or even adaptive. And so that's kind of an emergent area, but I think that's a really, really powerful tool, to be employed there.
So when we talk about AI, purely from a security standpoint of view, it is the speed and the scale, that works in the favor, for businesses helping, secure endpoints. But at the time, there is some sort of human intervention that's required or necessary to ensure that, things are happening in the right way. Okay. And then now you have this third thing that's coming in, which is more towards AI driven automation, right? So you had first just AI doing things, then you had the human element to it, and then you have AI driven automation or AI driven cyber resilience, if I was to call it. How do you think role of continuous monitoring, okay, through AI or through AI driven automation or through a human AI connect is going to evolve?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So I think I referenced earlier this notion of desired state management. When you think about that endpoint, you want it to be patched to a level. You want to make sure that the security controls are in place. You want to make sure that other policy and configuration, for example, maybe your zero trust policy is in place and hasn't drifted. And so I think the first opportunity there for the automation and the application of the AI piece is really modeling the organization, understanding what the desired state should be. So one of the challenges when you're trying to define policies like this is actually knowing what is right. So the cool thing about AI is that it can actually learn from the behavior of your users what it is actually necessary for them to access and use and so on. So there's this opportunity on the one hand to kind of shape what the desired configuration state should be, and help automate that part of it. Well, now you've got that going, and then you can monitor, you can see that drift, and you can automate back. And one of the interesting things is a lot of times when we're trying to go apply some type of automation to a problem, sometimes that task, while understood to be that should be executed, something actually goes wrong in the execution. And so one of the really interesting AI opportunities there is for the AI to actually learn, hey, what happened here? Why couldn't I complete that task? Oh, I didn't have a permission or a privilege, or there was a file that was missing, or just some aspect of hygiene that just caused that process not to complete. So the super cool thing there is that over time, the AI can kind of learn, how to fix those problems. And you can imagine a feedback loop there where before it does that automatically the first time, it can raise awareness to a human expert and sort of ask permission and say, hey, I'm trying to get this thing right. I think the solution to fixing it is to do this. Do I have your permission to do it? And you can imagine the first 50 times the human might, say yes, yes, yes. And at some point you be comfortable enough where you let the AI do that autonomously. So you can imagine this kind of feedback loop where the human expert is increasingly over time only intervening on the things that are more, complex. And the other cool thing there is that you can apply that principle across organizations. So with our solution, we have many thousands of customers. There's tens of millions of endpoints out there. And so the interesting part is, imagine a bunch of our customers have given permission to the AI agent to perform this task. We can actually inform other organizations and say, hey, by the way, your peer group is very comfortable with this procedure. Maybe you would consider, doing it as well. And so you can kind of get that wisdom of crowds part of it going well. And so I think a lot of the goal there is to ultimately, because again, staffing is tight, experts are difficult to come by, to make sure that the experts are really focusing on that smaller sliver of things that really demand that expertise. And as we learn, the more routine things in the system overall helps us learn, all those more basic tasks and fixes can be increasingly automated. So that's that overall concept some folks refer to as agentic AI. There's some concepts around that. So
AI is evolving, the cybersecurity space. Where does that leave humans? Where does that leave you and me?
well, I'm a believer that there's always another level of expertise and value to be provided. And so I think the opportunity there is that we'll free people up to actually focus on those more creative things and more innovative solutions, and leave those things that are a bit more mundane, a bit more task oriented, manual, and frankly error prone. I think that's the other kind of thing. And I think a lot of people, when you look at their jobs, when I think about the things I end up doing in spreadsheets and things I don't like that. I'd be happy to have a machine take that off my plate. So I'm a believer. I'm optimistic. I don't think the machines are going to take over and rule the world. But the flip side, if you're a fan of Ian Banks, the author in the Culture series, if all that happens and the machines end up just taking care of us, then you can be like the guy in The Player of Games and just enjoy a life of leisure and entertainment and so on. So who knows? Maybe there's an upside to all that if we get there someday.
So John, I think one of the things that businesses category look at or should look at is that it's just not about preventing. As a security team within an organization, what are some of the key metrics that you should track to measure the effectiveness of any endpoint security strategy or solution that you're implementing?
No, that's a great question, Vikram. I would kind of pick three. And there's more. You could probably do more. You can always do more, but I would probably start with three pretty fundamental areas. So one would be that very basic, already known vulnerability metric that or area that we were talking about. Again, it's sort of shocking that 40% of successful attacks can be traced back to something we already knew about. So for me, it starts with understanding what is my OS patch age, what are my application patch age, what's the state of that endpoint from a critical vulnerabilities perspective, and then having some policy around that and some KPIs around that in terms of what is your acceptable risk. And what I would suggest to folks is that, when the breakout time is measured in, could be minutes or single hours, if your OS and application patch age in our data shows that it's often, 30 to 45 days or even longer, there's probably a KPI gap there because the breakout time is not measured in 45 days. And the key thing is this is for stuff we already know about. Forget the 0-day stuff. So that would be one thing. I think folks have to measure that, maniacally and really rethink the KPI. And whether, for example, a lot of folks would say, well, I'm on the Patch Tuesday 30-day cycle. I'm probably okay. Well, maybe not. The other one is, so that takes care of the things that we know about. And then you have your EPP, XDR, other security controls that are on that endpoint that are guarding you against the things that you don't know about. I think the key KPI there is a lot of folks assume that's sort of a fire and forget model. In other words, I deploy the solution, I'm all good, and now I'm protected. Well, that drift problem occurs. And so what we see consistently in our data is that there are a percentage of endpoints in almost every enterprise where that critical EPP XDR tool Doesn't matter who it's from, CrowdStrike, Sophos, SentinelOne, pick your favorite. It's just literally not there. And sometimes when it's there, it's not at the right patch or version level, and or it may not be running. And the nature of those things is they have to be A, there, B, at the right level, and C, running continuously. And so having KPIs where you are literally measuring that every single day, to understand, do I have endpoints out there that are literally not protected? And or maybe they're not at the right level of compliance from a patching and update perspective, or maybe those things are okay, but the service has stopped running on that endpoint. It needs to be restarted, healed, and so on. And so I think that's another critical set of KPIs, because most companies, especially big ones, are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars per year on that. And if you have a couple, 3-4% of your devices where the tool is literally not there, A, that's not good use of dollars. B, that's creating the opening, the toehold for the bad actor to come in. So that's that second KPI. I think the third KPI would be kind of shifting more towards, I just have to assume something bad is going to happen. And so now I think the critical KPI becomes, what is my actual recovery time to bring endpoints and my users back to full productivity? I think what a lot of folks, most organizations of some sophistication will have a BCDR strategy, but a lot of times that's focused on the servers and sort of this notion of bringing back a minimally viable amount of service, particularly for your external customer facing parts of your systems, which totally makes sense. Nobody would say don't do that. But I think a lot of times those KPIs are not covering, and how long does it take me to bring all of my end users back to a fully productive state? And I think if we were to look back to July of this year, when the CrowdStrike BSOD event happened, I think a lot of folks had an encounter that day where there's sort of two versions of this. There's, like, if you ever Baron von Moltke, he famously said that, like, you have a plan, then you have your first encounter with the enemy, and then you're playing. The version I remember as a child is Mike Tyson famously said, "Everybody has a plan until I punch him in the face." So
Absolutely. Yeah.
think which one you want, but that was kind of a punch in the face sort of day. And so I think a lot of folks on that day realized that maybe my BCDR program and my KPIs and my metrics are on that, particularly in terms of how long does it take me to bring all of my users back to a productive state if something like that happens, was a gap. And that cost millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars in some cases, and even more for certain organizations based on how long it took them to recover from the Tyson moment that happened that day.
So talking about these three metrics that you talked about, right? How do you think they differ for maybe mid-sized organizations or startups? Would they be doing anything different, or do you think it's still the same?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I think what I would say about a startup is that, look, at the end of the day, if you're a startup and you have intellectual property and things like that are valuable, you really shouldn't have a much different posture than any other different type of organization. I think the same kind of two first key metrics apply no matter what. I think on the third one, if you're a small organization, if you have 50 employees that you have to figure out how to bring back, and even if it wasn't the most elegant procedure, you might be able to figure that out. So maybe not quite as critical on that third dimension, but you should still have a plan, and it's real good to measure. But I think the second you get to medium, and we're not a massive organization, but we're 1,000 people, and we're still considered, we were considered small to mid. But for even at that size, trying to figure out, like, if you didn't have process, procedures, tools in place to recover 1,000 people and bring them back and be productive, and especially given what we do, folks rely on us, in a way that, so I would say, still that third KPI is probably going to be important even for smaller organizations. So,
and for our non-technical audiences, one of the questions that I have for you, when I look at endpoint security on my personal device specifically, I'm just looking at, what are the apps that I'm installing? Maybe Google once in a while releases a list saying, these are the apps that you need to get rid of. But are there other things that you would recommend that people should do on their personal devices to ensure that they are safe, from, any kind of things?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. If I were to say one thing, it's just like, wow, just pay attention to your email and to your text messages, because it's still like that phishing attack that really becomes that point of entry in a lot of cases. So just be super mindful. And a pretty good rule of thumb: if it feels a little bit shady, it's probably shady, and just think twice. And so I think that's, if I were to pick one thing that end users can do, is just be vigilant about what you're clicking on, and that's how you can probably help your organization more than any other thing. They should be worrying about the technical bits and bytes, but that's one thing that as users we can be vigilant about. And the variant of that would be, if anybody ever asks you for like money or write a check or do this or do that, pick up the phone and send a text, 2 factors. Like just mention, like, for example, in my case, Christy, I'm going to talk to Christy before I send a money based on or a request.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing is our instincts are always probably right. They're really good. And it's just like one of those things, if you just think about it for a minute, you'd probably say, no way, that's probably not something I should be doing. So that's probably how you can best help your organization.
On that note, John, what I'd love to do now is, to move on to the next section of and the final section of our podcast, which is getting to know you a little better. Quick rapid fire round for our audiences.
All right, let's do it.
All right, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. What book or movie would you recommend to people?
All right, that's going to be The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Very quickly, it came out in 2006 when I was a new dad at that point. And it's one of those books that really gets you thinking about kind of like, what would you do for your family if they needed you to? So that was just hit me at a particular time and place in my life when it got, so that one always sticks with me.
Right.
So.
I'm going to put that on my list. Favorite destination that you have been to or is on your bucket list?
All right. Well, I'm going to give you both. So I love Italy. I'm a Roman historical fiction buff. So first time going to Rome, seeing the Colosseum, Pantheon, and just Italy in general. Love it. Machu Picchu is the bucket list. Have not been there yet. Must do at some point. So.
Okay. What's that one hidden talent that people don't know about you?
All right. So I'm a pretty avid tennis player, and I'm a lefty.
Okay.
But in a pinch, I can actually switch the racket to my right hand and actually make a shot with my right hand. So that's I shouldn't be telling several 100,000 people that's like in my secret arsenal. But that is something that is, a little hidden talent I have there. So.
Okay. What is your favorite music artist?
Oh, so Rush, no doubt about it. Canadian band, if you don't know them,
No, I haven't heard of them. But probably I've heard, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't recall. Of late, I've moved.
Well, I'll send you our compilation.
Please do. By all means, of late, I've moved on to techno. So for the last year or so, is just music that's playing. Words have disappeared for me.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely dating myself when I say Rush. So there is that.
Absolutely. What would you rather do? Explore the sea or explore deep space?
For me, no doubt, deep space. I've been a hard science fiction fan forever, and just the kind of notion of being out there, being in space, and I think in particular, I would want to figure out like the whole escaping the solar system. That would be I'm not interested in a simple orbit around the Earth. I want to figure out how to get out of the solar system. So
if you could swap jobs with someone for a day, who would it be?
Let's see. I would go with Steve Kerr, who's the head coach for the Golden State Warriors. And the reason is he's an amazing leader. He's assembled an incredible team and staff room. So I would actually love to be there in a day, just to experience that group. And then also everybody always thinks they can do a better job than the head coach. So I would actually want to find out if I actually could for one day. I think the answer is no, but I'd like to try. So.
All right. Who's a better manager, you or your wife?
Oh, no doubt about it. Yeah, my wife. Some of the best advice she ever gave me was, in fact, as I started kind of, coming into roles like this, he said, John, you're a leader, but you're not
Right.
necessarily the best manager. Understand the difference and then apply accordingly, and then you will have much more success. And so I think that's some of the best advice that I've ever gotten, and advice that I actually also rely on. Because some people, by the way, are fantastic managers, and that's, but understanding sometimes that difference is pretty important. So thank you, Rebecca, for that.
Right. And the final one, what's the most spontaneous thing that you've ever done?
Let's see. That was probably quitting my job at Microsoft, and the closest I ever came to doing this sort of startup in a garage. We were in Seattle, so of course it had to be the back room of a coffee shop.
Yes.
But essentially the moral equivalent. So yeah, that was probably the most spontaneous thing, and that kind of is what put me on that journey. That maybe to bring it all the way back to the start. That was what led to the Vire, the Visto, good meeting Christy and the team, and here we are. So full circle.
So thank you so much, John, for joining us. Really appreciate this. And I think some of the insights that you have shared, on how we could keep ourselves secure, how could businesses keep themselves secure, what are some of the metrics that they should be looking at, and what is that you guys are doing at Absolute Security, to help businesses do that as well, are going to go a long way. So thank you once again. Really appreciate this. And any parting words that you'd love to give?
Well, I just first say I thank you for the opportunity, Vikram. It was great. Would love to come back and do it again sometime. Again, I think I'm just going to sort of reinforce that what the end user can do to help the company. It's just be vigilant, apply that common sense, and run it through the filter of, if this was happening at my front door, what would I do? And you will up a lot and may prevent a breach at your company by applying that. So
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on YouTube, Instagram, or your favorite podcast app. Catch past episodes and more at techdogs.com. See you next time.